So here's the thing. One, I think, error in the discourse around the Kennedy assassination that is not helped by Oliver Stone's movie is the fixation on Dealey Plaza and the ballistics and which angle came the bullet that tore JFK's head off. I think all the stuff is minorly interesting, and to the extent that it can be proven, I think is good. Personally, I don't have any serious sort of dog in the fight, whether there was a grassy knoll or whether Lee Harvey Oswald was up in the book depository. I've been there. I visited there. Interesting little historical thing, but I don't know specifically about that. And I think the focus on that has been, and our scope has been, I think, maliciously narrowed. And I don't think by Oliver Stone, because I will give credit to Stone a little bit, but like I think the CIA wants us to talk about ballistics all the time, or the film all the time, because the reality is that the CIA was very familiar with Lee Harvey Oswald, and they didn't want you to know about it, and they covered that up to the Warren Commission. But now we know, and that's the revelation here, that the CIA, that Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset, and circumstantially, this shouldn't be it wouldn't be a shock to people who are familiar with certain parts of Oswald's biography. He was a Marine. Not only was he a Marine, he was a Marine at Atsugi Air Base, which was the air base in Japan where the U-2 spy plane was flying out of. So, and he was around there, so pretty high level. And then he came when he left the Marines. And I don't have these details but so I'll just gloss over some parts of it. Took a trip over to Russia, where Russia's like, this guy's clearly like a spy, right? Like this isn't just something people regularly do. They treated and they met him with counter espionage things. There's a whole branch of theory that he had them help them shoot down the U-2 spy plane to try to precipitate war, which is I'd be interested to see people comment more on that. Maybe we'll talk to Jefferson Morley. I'm going to try to get him on the show, or maybe some other author. But so this guy, and then he comes back to the States with all this in mind, and he becomes a communist. And the sincerity of his communism, I think, is something that has been called into question as far as I've been aware of this stuff. But what's funny is I want to share, and what I appreciate having David here for is because David is somebody who is familiar with exactly what the ideological content of the militant and the worker,
the daily worker,
the daily worker, our friend here, the machine, give me free stuff 14 doesn't have the daily worker in, but yeah, the daily worker, which the militant is the Trotskyist paper, is my understanding, and the worker is the Communist parties. Is that correct?
So much more Stalinist.
And so there's been this picture of Oswald going around ever since the assassination that this line has been taken from it. Oswald was a communist. He moved to the USSR at one point, which again, the USSR was like, this guy's a spy, this former Marine. He handed out socialist propaganda. You know, the photo below, left hand rifle, right hand, socialist newsletters, the militant and the worker. And, you know, again, like, I guess just what, if you were said like the CIA planted, had a guy pose like that, I mean, what's your generic reaction, David?
I mean, come on. I mean, we know, right? I mean, these are two papers. Like, if you think that Trotskyists hate capitalists, you should hear them talk about what they call, state capitalism, or
right,
the Soviet Union.
Yeah, this is like if somebody assassinates a world leader and then says they're a really big fan of both the Majority Report and Jimmy Dore show.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, is it, and why is that?
Well, because here's the thing. Sorry, no,
go ahead.
Just put on my thinking cap for a second, right? There are two ways you can take it. I think the way that I think most of us are inclined to, that you seem incompatible, seems a little strange to make those connections. Or if there are connections, they're extremely tenuous, because like that's the kind of thing where, like, if you are a non-socialist who wants to become a socialist and you're like, oh, these are the two socialist things, I'm going to put them next to each other to show how socialist I am, would do, right? What I'm saying is that, like, it's either, incoherent in the sense of like it's a stage, it's misdirection, or it's incoherent in the sense of this person doesn't have any of those connections that they're claiming to have.
Yep.
Right? Neither of them look good for the official story.
Right. Exactly. And Tom from Macubia, love you, but Oswald was a Marxist in the Marines. That's dubious. I mean, perhaps that's a cover story because they were grooming an asset that was going to, for instance, infiltrate something like the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in
I,
New Orleans. Go ahead.
I'm just going to be very clear here, Matt, and
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
mean this to undermine you.
of
I'm
course.
just going to admit to the audience here, I'm not, I don't have a position on the JFK stuff, not because of anything other than like I have just never found the ability to be interested in this. And I'm not trying to be rude here. It just has never been something that I've spent more than 2 minutes. So like when Matt's telling me these things, I'm learning about this in real time with the rest of y'all.
Yeah. So I want to play this. This is from Jefferson Morley. And let me credit Oliver Stone because I do not recommend that movie for like an actual good orientation about this. I think there's just weird emphases, and it's read a book instead. There's much better books out there that can be more specific about this. But in the wake of that, the
Mm-hmm.
interest it caused led to the JFK Records Act that is literally forcing this stuff out and proving what like all these people at like the Mary Farrell Foundation. I remember when I was first exposed to these people, I thought they were wingnuts,
Mm,
right? And like that's and all respect to Chomsky, I love Noam Chomsky, but I remember in like 2002, I just got the internet, and I saw somebody ask a question about to Chomsky about the JFK assassination, and he basically said everyone was wasting their time.
mm.
And because JFK was a Cold War hawk anyway. And I'll just say, like, I understand that impulse in other people, but I also think it's frankly, when you get closer to the policy debates around there, like it's less clear about that. But also, those folks got the goods. They've won transparency from
Mm.
our government and how the national
Yeah.
security state operates. So, like, I don't like Oliver Stone, but like I have to give kudos to what he was able to do with that film.
I think that's a good point. It's like it's worth it just in it itself. The controversy around it to force the government to be more transparent. Um, I will just say again, as somebody who is not well versed in the stuff, so feel like I can be fairly neutral, right? If that's fair, Matt.
Yeah, of course.
Um,
We love that around here. Fair and balanced.
I will say that like I think there's 100% an argument because like LBJ, monstrous figure when it comes to Vietnam. I mean, this is somebody who, when was asked about why we're in Vietnam, he put his nuts on the table, which is funny for a second. Then you remember they talk about genociding and killing a lot of people, like
Yeah.
disgusting.
Mhm.
Domestically, probably one of the more interesting out of like the liberal politicians that we've had, like somebody who had like a fairly, if radical would be the wrong way to put it, but like anyone who's trying to uphold some of FDR kind of mantle of doing some form of like social democracy in this country. I mean, I think LBJ sort of did show
Mhm.
an alternate path, but like one of the best arguments I think for people who do think there's something up with the JFK stuff is that regardless of if you think JFK was like a Cold War hawk or not, I think there's no doubt about it that the interest in international politics and affairs between LBJ and JFK was vast in the sense
Mhm.
that like LBJ was somebody who was handled by his handlers. LBJ did what he was sort of told on that.
Right.
He might have pushed people around domestically, right? Which is why he's an interesting president.
Yeah, yeah.
But JFK seemed to, again, you could take that either way. Like maybe JFK was more hawkish, right? Or less hawkish than others. But JFK did take an interest in those kind of things. And I think in a way that LBJ never
You
was
know,
interested.
and to get into the foreign policy context of this a little bit more specifically, like I think well, this is documented now. LBJ uh he helped like the Warren Commission Snow job and all that stuff, but he also fought against this narrative that Cuba or the Russians were responsible for it. So
Mm.
like he de-escalated well, actually, let's play this clip
Yeah.
from Jefferson Morley, and maybe I can pause it in the way and just give a little bit of context here because you agree. Like I think basically just to summarize what I was going to say is LBJ did not take the bait. on framing JFK's assassination on Cuba or the Russians. But then he gave them a consolation with Vietnam. Would be how I summarize that. But here's Jefferson Morley on what the CIA was hiding and when we came to know about it. And this is fairly. The NBC News is the article here, so this isn't just some crazy left-wing press, somewhere.
What the CIA is hiding is what they've always hidden, which is their sources and methods as relate to Lee Harvey Oswald. By sources and methods, I mean spy techniques, infiltration, deception, psychological warfare, wiretapping, and the like. That's been the story since 1963, but we can answer that question, what are they hiding, with more specificity now. And this is the result of a lot of work by me and other researchers associated with the Mary Farrell Foundation. What the CIA is hiding is a covert operation that involved Lee Harvey Oswald, used him for intelligence purposes in the summer of 1963, 3 months before President Kennedy was killed. This is an extraordinarily serious claim, and it has profound implications for the official story. The CIA knew far more about the lone gunman than they are admitting even today. So this story deserves the close.
And so I'll just say it like that. I don't think Morley takes a firm position on whether he was the lone gunman or not, but who we know as the lone gunman, the CIA lied to the Warren Commission about if they knew anything about the guy.
Scrutiny. That's why the Mary Farrell Foundation is bringing it to the attention of the press and the public. To understand this very complex story, it's important to understand 3 key JFK developments that have happened since the 1990s, information that was developed or found by the review board, and what we have learned. This is information that was not available to the Warren Commission and has not been widely reported in the media, but there's little dispute that these are true. The first is the complete declassification of the CIA's file on Lee Harvey Oswald. That did not take place until 2001. It only took 38 years. But when that was done, we had a whole new understanding of what the CIA knew about Oswald before the assassination. According to the official story, the CIA didn't know much. Deputy Director Richard Helms told the Warren Commission that the CIA's information about Oswald before November 22nd was, and I quote, probably minimal. The declassification of the file showed that Helms's testimony was definitely false. In fact, CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton had opened a file on Oswald when he defected to the Soviet Union in November 1959 as a 20-year-old ex-Marine. Angleton's minions then monitored this allegedly unimportant character as he made his way from Moscow to Minsk to Fort Worth to New Orleans to Mexico City and finally to Dallas. A handful of top CIA officers all knew about Oswald's travels, his politics, and his personal life while JFK was alive. In fact, they had even read his mail. A second key point that we've learned since the 1990s concerns the use of deception operations in 1963. These were unknown to the Warren Commission and are now established fact. Perhaps the most notorious of these was COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which was a joint CIA-FBI program to harass and disrupt leftist groups that U.S. policymakers considered an obstacle to their goals. Another was Operation Northwoods, discovered by Judge Thunheim and the Review Board in 1997. This was a Pentagon scheme to provoke a war with Cuba by staging a spectacular act of violence in the United States and using trusted covert personnel, CIA officers, to arrange for the blame to fall on Fidel Castro, thus giving...
I just want to pause it there and just say, that's fact. The Operation Northwoods memo is readable. I think it was Lyman Lemnitzer. And this is a really important context to understand, and it's one that I can't really remove from my understanding of even modern conflict, which is that there are psychos at the top of these militaries. And just to spell out and just to remind folks what they said about Northwoods, a spectacular act of violence planned in America domestically. This is the CIA, and they're going to point the finger at Cuba so as to get a war. And JFK said no to that. And I just think, like, if you can simultaneously accept that that was a plan that got all the way to the president's desk, that we also assassinate, as particularly at this time of the world, assassinate world leaders, democratically elected world leaders, like Lumumba was around that time, like others, then I think it is. I think, like, the barrier you should have, that like JFK would be whacked by these same folks. And the thing to say about JFK, and I understand why people say he was a warhawk, because he ran on the missile gap. Democrats do that stuff. They try to outflank Republicans on the right. And I'll also say, more importantly, that JFK, there's this movie, 7 Days in May. It came out around this time, about a coup of a president by the military. JFK supposedly offered it the White House as a shooting location for it. And he was asked about like, could this happen? Could a coup happen? And he basically said, like, you would need multiple sorts of things like the Bay of Pigs invasion. And just to go over what that was, the CIA had a plan to invade Cuba that was hatched and oversaw by Vice President Nixon in the late 50s. Eisenhower was a bit of an absentee president because he had a heart attack, so Nixon was the one working with the CIA. There's a very close election. Some say stolen. There's probably funny business on both ends, so Nixon doesn't challenge. But he was supposed to be the one there when they did the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion happens in the first few months of Kennedy's presidency. Kennedy does not okay an overt air invasion of Cuba after the initial invasion fails, which I think Nixon probably would have. I think that since he was there planning with it. And so basically JFK ultimately says, like, that pissed them off. That pissed a lot of guys off. You have a lot of, like, exiles that were trained for that had assurances from the CIA that we're going to do this. And hey, when we get to the point, they'll let us invade Cuba. And he didn't let them invade Cuba. And so Kennedy basically said it would take a number of instances like that. Well, later there was things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and other things like that. And I think, like, the irony, to bring this back to Chomsky, is Chomsky spends a lot of his time making, I think, important points about, like, there is a difference between Hillary and Trump, for instance. And I just think, like, there's a difference between JFK and Nixon back then. And so, like, and there, and like the one that the generals would have noticed. And so I've talked about this before, but Anthony Summers, Not in Your Lifetime, Talbot's Devil's Chessboard, and would be the two that I would start with if people want to read.
So, I mean, there was all this hope from some folks, among many of the other misplaced hopes with Trump, that Trump was going to drop the JFK files. I mean, as somebody who's sort of kept up with this, are there any other things that you're sort of hoping? I mean, obviously there's things you don't know about, but, like, are there any other kind of, like, hot things that might be classified right now that people are hoping to get out? Or
there's a few files by, like, a few, like, CIA folks that also later, like, were point people on, like, congressional investigations that were assured, like, we don't have any connection to the thing, right? And then it turned out, oh, actually it was very connected. There are things like that are still out there. But I also do want to underline, like, there's this weird thing that's happening where a lot of this stuff is being confirmed, and the reaction, like, Lee Harvey Oswald was a CIA asset, right? Like, whether he was the gunman or not, like, that is very significant. And what is a CIA asset? And I also want to, I forgot, there's one point where they said, like, with that COINTELPRO stuff, that the Fair Play for Cuba committee was targeted. That's one of the main sort of performances of communism that Oswald Oswald did is he was in New Orleans and he found, surprise, surprise, a right-wing radio outlet. And he's like, hey, I'm a communist. Change my mind. um, and there's a radio appearance where he's talking for like 40 minutes on about like, hey, hands off Cuba. You know, I'm a Marxist Leninist that supports Cuba. And when you know that he was well known by the CIA, and you know the CIA targeted that group, and then he's flaunting around there being like the most interviewable communist in New Orleans. Yeah. I mean, what are we doing at this point?
At a time when New Orleans was definitely a friendly place for that kind.
That's exactly right. Like they talk about how basically it was like borderline getting into fights. Like,